Today we have Dr. Jose Franco from the USDA-ARS Northern Great Plains Research Lab giving a presentation titled No-Till Organic Transition with and Without Grazing. For a bit of background, Jose is a post-doctoral research agroecologist at the USDA-ARS Northern Great Plains Research Lab. He has an interest in agroecology and the application of ecological theory to crop production. His research emphasis is on alternative and integrated cropping systems to enhance resource use efficiency and reduce risks. I believe some of you on the call were at the Regenerative Agriculture Conference in Brandon last week, and so I'm sure this is a very interesting and relevant follow-up to that meeting if you were able to attend. So thank you, Jose, and I will let you take it over. And just a reminder to everyone to please mute your phones. And Jose, if you feel like you hear some background noise, feel free just to comment on that and give people a gentle reminder. And I'm going to mute myself now.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Jose Franco. I'm a researcher in MANDAN, North Dakota. And I'm going to talk about a specific project that I've been working on and looking at organic transition approaches and doing it without the use of tillage, and then also the incorporation of livestock grazing into the system, and looking at some of the trade-offs with and without grazing, and some of the impact on some of the parameters we're looking at, which I'll mention here shortly. So I'm going to slide 2. So we know that weed management is a major issue in organic systems, of course, but when we talk about no-till or zero-till organic management, we're really limiting the tools that organic producers that you all have to control weeds and manage weeds. So there's this paper out there by Pat Carr, who's at Montana State now, from 2011, that really calls for future research looking at the use of cover crops and integration of forages and grazing to be able to manage organic systems without the use of tillage. And that's sort of the basis of my research here. So on slide 3, when we think about sort of the hierarchy of agricultural systems and the goals of sustainability goals of production systems, and this is across production types, whether it's conventional systems or organic or somewhere in between. When you integrate cattle or any kind of livestock, you increase the complexity of it and management that's required to produce a crop or produce any other kind of product. But you're also potentially decreasing your risk, right? And we think of integrated crop livestock systems as sort of high on that spectrum of sustainability goals. So on slide 4, this talks about a little background of the study. So this was initiated in 2016 here, and we're located just sort of southwest, south central part of North Dakota. So this is a 3-year organic transition. As you all know, it takes 3 years to transition, but also we're looking at that first certified crop year. So this is a 4-year study, and it's under no-till management for the most part. We did do some tillage the very first year of the study, but we have not since then. And I won't go into all of the objectives, but basically we're looking at different cover crop mixtures, objective-based cover crop mixtures for their ability to provide a certain service. So that could be, building the soil, enhancing soil organic matter, that sort of thing. Or it could be suppressing weeds, or it could be providing services for pollinators and other beneficial insects. And then we're also evaluating grazing as a way of, essentially as a way of recovering cost. So if you graze these cover crops, is there a way there to recover costs during that transition period? And also looking at some additional benefits that grazing can provide for the system. And then, of course, we'll look at that first certified crop, which would be next year, and we're going in with an oat crop. So oats will be our first certified organic crop. So on slide 5, just going into the grazing side a little more. So when we think of grazing, we also think of, is that a way of recycling nutrients and enhancing soil fertility? Can we use grazing to maybe help manage the cover crops that we are planting? And can we use grazing as a tool to reduce weeds and kind of control the weed seed bank? So on slide 6, that goes into some of the treatments in a little more detail. So we have a total of 6 treatments. One of them is an annual crop rotation. So if I'm a producer transitioning to organic production, and I continue on with an annual crop rotation, what does that do to some of the services to the soil and weed seed bank and that sort of thing? Going in with a perennial forage, which in our case is an alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass mixture, which was primarily alfalfa. And then those annual cover crop mixtures that I mentioned earlier, one of them specifically to help suppress weeds, another mixture specifically to build the soil. So we picked cover crops that we thought would meet those objectives. Another mixture specifically to provide floral resources for pollinators. And then a multi-purpose cover crop mix, which was the goal there, was to try to achieve all 3 of those goals. And all these things are important, we know, for producers, especially organic producers. We know that weeds are a big issue. We know that we need to build the soil and soil fertility. And especially here, we have a fine sandy loam that we're working on, so that's a bigger issue for us here. And then of course we know the issue with pollinators. That's particularly important in this region because we're one of the top honey producing states in the U.S. So we need some of those floral resources during the growing season. So that's kind of the treatments in a nutshell. And then of course half of those. So we have plots of all these different cover crops and different mixtures. And then half of that is being grazed, and then the other half is not being grazed. And I'll go into when we're grazing and how that looks in just a moment. So this is a lot on there, but basically all I want you to know is that in May of 2016, we did a light disking, and that was the last time we applied a herbicide. This area that we're working on had not been intensively managed. So we're working kind of starting from pretty disadvantageous spot because we had a pretty heavy weed seed bank, pretty heavy weed load. So we thought we'd give it a disking and then apply a herbicide to try to get control of that weed seed bank to start out with. And then in 2016 we grazed in August. And, in 2017 we grazed in October, and I'll go into why. And then 2018 we also grazed in August. So if we go on to slide 9, I wanted to talk about rainfall distribution for a little bit here because what I'll be talking about later on is really reflective of what's happening with rainfall. And you all as producers know that if you don't receive timely precipitation, it's really difficult to get, either a catch crop going or, you have your cover crop mixtures in. It's really hard to get them going and achieve the goals you want with those crops if you don't get that timely precipitation. So I wanted to talk about that for a few slides. So in slide 9, we look at the rainfall totals for Mandan, North Dakota, and that's actually 2016 through 2018. You see that 2016 we had total rainfall of 445 millimeters or 17.5 inches for the year. And then 2017, as you all recall, pretty bad year. We had a drought. We only had about 290 millimeters or 11.4 inches. And then in 2018, we went back up to about 427 millimeters. So if we dive down into the growing season, the rainfall patterns are pretty different. And receiving that timely precipitation is not predictable, right, from year to year. And this is kind of a 2-month moving average of monthly rainfall totals for 2016 to 2018 on slide 10. So you can see that in 2016 we had that rainfall early on in the growing season, so we got an excellent cover crop that year. Between that and the management that we applied, we really had a nice cover crop stand in 2016, which I'll show some data on in just a moment. But in 2017, we just did not get that precipitation in early on, and we planted in June that we really needed. So if we look at growing season rainfall totals on slide 11, you see that I think somebody needs to probably mute. I hear some background noise there. Sorry about that. So if we look at slide 11 and we look at the May through July totals, we see that that total was well under half in 2017 of what it was in 2016 and even in 2018. And this really is really important because it'll really determine what happens later on with cover crops and our ability to suppress weeds and provide a good cover. So if we look at slide 12, this is cover crop production in 2016. So we're getting upwards of 4,000 in some cases kilograms per hectare. So we're getting at least a couple of tons per acre of production from some of these cover crop mixtures. And you can see pictures there of a really nice sorghum Sudan stand. You see in the second picture, kind of in the middle, the sorghum Sudan after it was grazed on the one side, and then on the other side is where it was not grazed. And then the bottom picture is mustard that was planted in the pollinator mixture, and you can see that it's a really nice, beautiful stand that attracted a lot of bees that particular year. So if we move on to slide 13, this is cover crop production in 2017. Now this was the drought year, and you can see that now. I'll compare all 3 years all in one slide in just a moment, but I just wanted to show that we did get some cover crop production that was planted that year in these annual cover crop mixtures, but it was not nearly as dense or as much biomass as in 2016. If we go on to slide 14, you can see that the production is steadily declining. Really the only treatment that had fairly decent growth was the weed suppression mix, and that was a proso millet. And you can see that picture there. You can see the rows of the proso millet, but you can see a lot of weeds also competing for resources with that proso millet. So we got a pretty decent stand, but it just did not get very tall because of that competition. So on slide 14, that really shows you there how cover crop production from these annual cover crop mixtures declined from 2016 through 2018. And that's really all I wanted to show there. And then in slide 16, I went ahead and added forage production from the perennial mixture. And I remember the perennial mixture is the alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass mixture. So in 2016, is the establishment year. So obviously we're not going to get any production there. In 2017, we got 2 cuttings off of both the grazed and ungrazed side. And then in 2018, we got 3 cuttings off the grazed side and 4 cuttings off the ungrazed side. So you can see just how much productivity there was planting that perennial versus having those annual cover crop mixtures with the lack of timely precipitation. So on slide 17, I'll start talking about hay production specifically. So on slide 18, if we look at hay production in 2017, so I need to clarify a few things here. First, I should mention the June. So hay production from June was primarily a rye crop that we planted in the fall of 2016. We planted a rye red clover mixture in the fall, and then in June 2017 we hayed that rye. And in the case of the perennial mixture, that was a rye alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass mixture. And I'm not showing the annual crop treatment here because we actually took the grain off for a cash crop there on the crop, but I'm not going to talk about that, just to kind of keep it a little more simple. So what I have here is one row grazed for that particular treatment, and then the next row is the ungrazed for that particular treatment. So in June, that was a rye hay, and then in August, we took another cutting off of the perennial, which is alfalfa, and that shows the tons per acre that we took off of that. And then also my number, I realized this last night as I was reviewing my slides, the ungrazed alfalfa number for June is actually 2.21. I believe the slide I sent has 1.61 or something to that effect. So we actually produced more rye hay or rye alfalfa mixed hay off of the ungrazed side than we did from the grazed side. Yep. So
sorry, Jose, I'm just going to interrupt quick. I just want to send a quick reminder to the last few people who joined the call to make sure you mute your lines. Just getting a bit of feedback. So you can do that just by *6 on your phone. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Catherine. So that's what the production looked like, and it's kind of interesting. And I haven't run any stats on this, so I can't tell you if they're different statistically. But if you just look at the numbers, in the case of the perennial, we actually had higher production on the ungrazed side. In the case of the soil building and the weed suppression and multi-purpose, we actually had higher rye hay production off of the grazed side. And for whatever reason, the pollinators had less production on the grazed side compared to the ungrazed. So there's some interesting dynamics there that we need to dive into a little more, that I have not done just yet. So if we look at the value of that hay on slide 19 for 2017, now these values for the ungrazed alfalfa are correct. We see that. So I should preface this by saying that I used USDA alfalfa hay prices received. So this is for North Dakota, and U.S. producers probably know this as well, but we know that local prices could sometimes vary quite a bit. So I went ahead and just used the North Dakota state prices just for this analysis. So for June, the alfalfa hay prices were $125 per ton. For August, the USDA alfalfa hay prices received were $115 per ton. And then for the rye hay, I used other hay price, which was $93 per ton for June for North Dakota as a whole. So that kind of gives you an idea of the potential revenue coming back to the farm just from the hay production itself. Now, take into account that this is all still preliminary, and we still haven't added in the cost of gasoline or diesel and the time and hours put in and that sort of thing. So this is just strictly hay production value. So if we look at slide 20, that just kind of gives you an idea of what the fields look like after they were cut. The rye was cut and then ready for baling. And then you can see on that top left picture that one treatment there that's standing is the annual crop rotation. So that rye was left and then later combined. And then that slide 21 just kind of shows you an idea of the stubble that remained. So on average, it's about 4 to 5 inches of rye stubble that we left on the ground there. Okay, so on slide 22, we look at hay production and value from 2018. So now this year, in the fall of 2017, because we grazed a little bit later, we tried to go in with rye again, a rye hairy vetch mixture, but we dormant seeded it, meaning we went in a little bit late when it was already colder out, and we really didn't get much production off of that for the spring. So we didn't hay anything. We just off of those rye, off of any of the treatments that had rye. So these are values just off of the perennial treatment that had alfalfa and intermediate wheatgrass. So we did hit it a little bit harder, and what I mean by that is we took more cuttings because we want it to be aggressive, because we're trying to reduce the alfalfa stand for next year. So we took three cuttings off of the gray side, and we took 4 cuttings off of the ungray side, and you can see that we produced quite a bit of alfalfa this year actually, and we had a really nice stand. Even our the gentleman that manages our livestock, when he came over to my plots and looked at the alfalfa stand, he was pretty impressed, and I think I might have even convinced him maybe the organic was the way to go with alfalfa production. But so we had a really nice alfalfa stand. We got a total of about 3.4 tons per acre of alfalfa cut off the gray side, and just over 4 tons per acre on the ungray side, which if you assign a dollar value to, and again, we're using North Dakota state average alfalfa hay prices put out by USDA, and there are the numbers there at the bottom for you to look at. We're looking at about $354 of hay production value on the gray side, and just over $400 per acre on the ungray side. So we go to slide 23. I just kind of want to tail off a little bit on other work with perennials and just sort of the benefit of having perennials in a system with some of the other work that we've done. Now this work was not managed organically, but I think could still have some relevant information for organic producers. So if we look on slide 24, what we did is we wanted to know how long does a perennial need to be in place to see yield benefits to the subsequent crop, right? In this case being spring wheat. And then how long does that benefit last after you convert from a perennial back to the annual cash crop? And what we found here was that, and CWF is continuous fertilized spring wheat. So that's being compared to a spring wheat. It's fertilized every year, and that's in spring wheat every year. So with just 2 years of alfalfa, our spring wheat yields were comparable to those of that continuous fertilized spring wheat. 3 and 4 years of alfalfa, we started seeing yields that were greater than that continuous spring wheat. 5 years of an alfalfa with intermediate wheatgrass, then you start seeing spring wheat yields that are comparable to that continuous one that's fertilized every year. So, and we also see that those yield benefits last at least 4 and 5 years if you have alfalfa or that alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass after you convert back to the cash crop. So that's a potential savings there in fertilizer, essentially. And then we also did find some soil benefits to having those perennials, as you would expect. But something that was interesting is that, so not only are we seeing a reduction in soil bulk density, the mitigation of soil acidification, increased particulate organic matter, and increased water-stable aggregates, what we're seeing is that with that alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass mixture, we're actually seeing more benefits after 4 years in that perennial as compared to just alfalfa by itself. And that's one of the reasons why in this organics study that we're talking about today is the reason why we went with an alfalfa intermediate wheatgrass mixture. So now if we look on slide 25, now I kind of wanted to dive a little bit into the value of grazing these cover crops. And again, this is all pretty preliminary, and I should say I'm not an economist, but this is these are values that our economist here suggested I use. So if we look at the value of grazing cover crops, if we assume that a typical cow typically needs about 30 pounds of forage per day, and then using the hay prices, again using USDA's prices for North Dakota for when we did graze. So for instance, in 2017, the price of hay, other hay, was $74 per ton in August when we grazed. In 2018, the price of other hay for when we grazed in October was $69 per ton. So if you use those values, and if you go to that third bullet point, so other hay price of $74 a ton gives you a grazing value of about $1.11 per cow per day. So then if you take that times the pounds of production of your cover crop mixtures divided by that requirement of 30 pounds per forage per day, it kind of gives you an idea basically of dollars per acre of savings. So how much am I saving by grazing my cover crops and not having to purchase hay or rent pasture to put my livestock on, essentially. So if we go to slide 26, that kind of gives you a quick rundown. And of course, I did include ungrazed here, but we know that the ungrazed was obviously not grazed, so there's not a grazing value there, but I just put it there as for comparison. And this is kind of a maximum potential value, because we still have to adjust for, okay, how much did the cattle actually graze versus what was out there. So that's a number we have not adjusted yet, but this is just sort of a maximum potential to give you an idea. So in 2016, we had obviously from the alfalfa side, that was an establishment year, so you wouldn't expect much. But if we look at those annual cover crop mixtures in 2017, that's quite a bit. And, going from $136 on the grazed soil building side, down to about $56 even on, or $69 on grazed pollinator. And I should also, I think we're getting a little more background noise.
Just a reminder to mute your phone if you just joined the call. *6 to mute. Sorry, Jose.
That's okay. Thank you. So I should also mention with this grazing value, because there's another dynamic that I haven't touched on yet. So this is just based off of production or biomass production of cover crops planted in that year, right? So in 2016, just the annual cover crops that were planted that year. In 2017, just the annual cover crops planted in 2017, and so forth. What I haven't just touched on, and I will in a couple of slides, is that we had actually quite a bit of carryover in some places of cover crops from the year before. So this grazing value, it does not take into account some of that carryover of cover crops from the previous year. So if we look at slide 28, essentially. I'll go into a little bit on the weed management, but this is all, again, very preliminary. So this is what I'm talking about, the carryover. So this is just from 2017. So the yellow part of each bar indicates cover crop production from crops planted that year in the annual cover crop mixtures. And then the gray bar is the carryover from the previous year. So one thing we are seeing is that based on the timing that we're using to terminate cover crops in the ungrazed side, and when we're grazing on the grazed side, at least in 2017, we actually did a better job of controlling cover crop carryover in that particular year. But I guess the flip side to that is, if we look on on slide 29, the flip side to that is in 2017, when we had a drought, really the bulk of productivity from those cover crop mixtures was actually the carryover from the previous year. So yes, grazing can help manage your cover crops, but given the timing, the management timing that we in 2016 in the fall, maybe having some carryover in 2017 actually is a good thing. Actually ended up being a good thing because that was probably the bulk of the productivity in 2017. So if we look at slide 30, you can see that has implications for weed dynamics as well. So if we look at the grazed side, we didn't have as much cover crop carryover in the grazed side as we did in the ungrazed, and that's because we had some of that cover crop coming back from the previous year, reseeding itself essentially, and competing with the weeds and being able to reduce weed competition essentially is what happened there. So there's an interesting dynamic there that it'll be interesting to see how that carries out into next year's crop. So if we go on to slide 31, so again, as I mentioned, this is all very preliminary. This is our third year of the study, and something that we are evaluating is the weed seed bank. So we took samples in 2016, and we'll take some more next year, and evaluate what have these different treatments, including the grazing, what have they done to the weed seed bank? Have they been able to reduce it, or has actually increased? And in turn, what does that do to the weed community? Are we able to suppress weeds better with some treatments than others? And then we will, in the spring, our plan is to graze again on the graze side to get a little more of those weeds, hopefully grazed, and then also get some nutrients back in the soil before we plant our oat crop in 2019. And then, of course, you may be wondering, well, if you graze some of the cover crops, then you're not putting that residue back in the soil. So what's that happening not only to soil fertility, but also to weed suppression, right? So there are some trade-offs there that we'll evaluate, by grazing and not grazing. And then, of course, we know that the perennial has been a really, really positive, and from previous studies that other people have done, we know that perennials during the transition phase are definitely a way to go. But what are some options for terminating those perennials without the use of tillage in organic systems? And that's something that sort of a side project that's resulted from this study. And slide 32 just kind of shows what we're trying to do with that perennial. And so we're looking at essentially three strategies for terminating that alfalfa stand for next year. And one of them is, and this is certainly not a new implement, using the undercutter, which is pictured on the left there, developed, I believe, at NC State, North Carolina State. But that's recommended for organic producers. And essentially what that does, you set it to whatever depth you want, 3 to 4 inches, and you basically it's supposed to slice the roots of the alfalfa right underneath it without causing too much soil disturbance, is the hope there. And so we did that this fall. And then in the spring, if we see that that all the cuttings we've taken this year don't reduce the stand, we'll probably go in with a spring undercut on a portion of that perennial treatment. And then on another portion, we're going to try this organic approved herbicide that we tried last year on some of our just alleyways and borders. And so those are the options we're looking at to being able to terminate this alfalfa stand without intensive tillage and without these herbicides, of course, the non-organic herbicides. So my last slide, on slide 23, that just kind of gives you an idea of what that. So and I'm certainly not advocating for this specifically, this specific herbicide, but we used EcoBlend Pro weed control, and you see on that picture on the left, actually you see the yellow spots on the grass. So it did a pretty good job of knocking that grass back. It did come back eventually, but it knocked it back for a few days, at least for a couple of weeks. And on the right, when we were applying, well, I shouldn't say we, because I didn't, but when our technicians were applying the herbicide in our alleys, whenever they would stop, and then for a few seconds because they had to turn or do some other things, you can see that there's a row there, a line where it actually really did a good job. But of course, that means you have to apply more, and then the cost of that begins to add up. And of course, there's some drawbacks to the organic herbicide from a cost perspective. So we'll look at that cost benefit analysis with that as well. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I know I've kind of touched on a lot of things, but if I'm happy to discuss or answer any questions.